Greetings, valiant wanderers of the booktube. Welcome back to my little corner of the library. Now, today on the show we're going to be discussing one of the most important and influential works in all of classic literature. My name's Dan, you're watching Bookworm History, and this is the ingenious hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha by Miguel de Cervantes. A little background on the author himself. Miguel de Cervantes was born on or around September 29th, 1547, and not a whole lot is really known about his early life. Now, it's theorized the young Miguel studied under the Jesuits, learning to read and write. His father was a hidalgo of the nobility, although the family itself was fairly poor. And we do know that Miguel ultimately left Spain in 1570. As a result of disagreements with local law enforcement, it seems young Miguel had wounded a man in a duel. Making his way to Italy, young Miguel joined up with the Spanish forces stationed there, ultimately fighting in the naval battle of Lepanto in 1571 against the Turks, and serving with distinction, despite injuring his left arm, a wound which would plague him throughout the remainder of his life. Miguel continued to serve for the next 5 years until 1575, when he was ultimately furloughed, and it was making his way back to Spain that disaster struck. Despite having served with the military for 5 years, it was on the trip home where Miguel was captured by Barbary pirates, piracy then being a common occurrence in the Mediterranean. Young Miguel was captured by these pirates and taken to Algiers to serve as a slave for another 5 years. Over the course of these next 5 years, Miguel would attempt escape 3 times, proving unsuccessful each time, and in 1580 he was finally ransomed and did make his way back to Spain. It was at this point that he began to write plays and even a pastoral novel called Legalatea about local shepherds and sort of the dark side of that world. Despite some modest success as a playwright, he was ultimately unable to make his living through his pen and had to take a job as a tax collector in the province of Andalusia. Now, tax collecting proving to be just as unpopular a job in the 1580s as it is today, young Miguel would wind up in several tussles and disputes, ultimately serving time in jail several times. It was while he was in jail in Seville that he writes in the introduction to the first part of Don Quixote that he first came up with the idea for his ingenious hidalgo. Now, Don Quixote would first appear before the public in 1605, the first part having been printed in 1604 and appearing before the public early the next year. The book would prove successful, selling out several printings and being translated into both English and French. Cervantes would be 10 years in crafting the second part of his famous novel. Unfortunately, the popularity of the first part meant that the public didn't want to wait that long. Prior to the publication of Miguel's true second part, a false second part of the Adventures of Don Quixote appeared before the public in 1614. The book, written under the pseudonym of Alonso Fernandez de Avellaneda and published by a rival printing house, would appear in 1614, presumably as Cervantes was writing chapter 59 of his own second part. We'll talk about the reasons why we think he was up to chapter 59 and the effect that this book had on him a little bit later. Now, one of the overarching themes of Don Quixote is the blurring or blending of the lines of reality with fiction, both in the real perceived world in which we live and the fictional world in which Don Quixote lives. Now, although we don't typically discuss the content of the novels or themes or characteristics of the works in which we discuss on the show here, in the case of Don Quixote, it's impossible to discuss the real-world events behind the book without actually delving into some of the themes of the book itself. And this is because Cervantes himself blends reality so effectively that by the end of the book, even the reader doesn't really know what's truth and what is fiction. Don Quixote himself, the character, is perceived as being a madman, although is described as being a very sane one. The contrast comes about from Don Quixote's perception of roadside inns as castles, of himself as a noble knight-errant, and yet he is often remarked as being incredibly philosophical and very wise when remarking on any subject except for knight-errantry, in which he takes a deep and very profound belief. It's this dual idea of Don Quixote, the character, that ultimately provides the basis for Cervantes' blending or blurring of reality itself. Now, one of the first and most notable uses of this blurring technique comes from the author of the book itself, and by author I don't mean Miguel de Cervantes, although he was in fact the man who wrote the text. He claims in the prologue to the first part that he is not in fact the father of Don Quixote, he is the stepfather, merely stumbling across the manuscript and translating it. Thus he acts not as the actual creator, but simply as the messenger. Now, this narrator ultimately becomes a character within the book itself, albeit one separated from the action described within the text. However, he often remarks upon it, noting several passages as being apocryphal, or commenting upon the narrative itself, or why he translated certain things the way he did, or why he puts certain parts of the book in certain places. Now, this narrator character even goes so far as to further distance himself from the actual author of the story by saying that he only found the first 8 chapters of the manuscript. At the beginning of chapter 9, he says that he ran out of manuscript and ultimately tells a long-winded tale of how he came across the rest of it. He says he stumbled upon it accidentally, buying the notebooks and the loose leaves of paper comprising the manuscript from a local boy. However, they were written in Arabic, which the narrator character doesn't speak. Thus, he describes having to go to the local cathedral and finding a Moor to be able to translate the rest of the text. So he's not even the translator anymore at this point, he really is just the messenger, but continues to act as a character within the book. Now, if that weren't enough to blur the lines of reality as to who on earth is actually writing this text, Cervantes offers himself up as a character, as an actual named person within the book itself. Now, in the towards the end of the first part, there's a character known as the Captive, and his story, or the Captive's tale, tells of his being captured on the Mediterranean by Barbary pirates and taken to Algiers and serving as a slave. Ultimately, the Captive does escape of his own accord, something Cervantes was never able to achieve, Cervantes being ransomed. However, all of these experiences harken back to Cervantes' own. Thus, he weaves his own story into the text, even going so far in the Captive's tale to name himself as one of the officers involved in the original scuffle. His full name was Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, and the Captive makes mention of having served with an officer Saavedra. So Miguel de Cervantes ultimately injects even his own person, his own name, into the book. Now again, as if that weren't enough, it gets even more crazy. The first part of the book, which Miguel de Cervantes published in 1605, ultimately becomes the sort of MacGuffin device that moves the narrative within the second part of the book. Now, early in the second part of the book, Sancho Panza comes to Don Quixote and says that he ran into a man in town who says he's heard of Don Quixote and heard of Sancho Panza, and the reason that he's familiar with their adventures, all of the stories that had taken place within the first part of the book, is that they actually read them in a book. Within the book. Don Quixote says to Sancho he must summon this man to him, thus entering the student Sanson Carrasco, who would become a prominent character within the second part of the book. Now, Carrasco says that he did read the first part of the Adventures of Don Quixote, which describing all of the adventures that Cervantes had written in the first part of the book. All of the characters that Don Quixote would meet in the second part of the book are ultimately familiar with him already, having read the adventures of the first part of the book. So the book that we're reading is a plot device in the book that we're reading. It's upside down. Not only that, but Cervantes uses the second part of the book to reference, or to fix, mistakes that he made within the first part of the book. Most notably, what happened to Sancho's donkey. Now, the original printing in 1605 of the first part of the Adventures of Don Quixote, Sancho's donkey disappears one night. The next morning he is on foot. It's perceived that his donkey was stolen, and we know this because later on in the adventure, he sees the thief and he steals his own donkey back. However, prior to stealing his own donkey back, he is also described as riding his donkey. So the donkey disappears mysteriously one night, it's never mentioned in the text what actually happened to it, then Sancho is riding the donkey, and then he steals the donkey back. Sanson Carrasco asks, how can this possibly be? To which Sancho replies that, well, the reason for the donkey's disappearance suddenly is that when we were sleeping in a glade one night, a thief came by and propped him up on stakes, him being Sancho, who was asleep while sitting on his donkey, propped him up on stakes so that he was still in the same position and then walked the donkey out from under him, thus stealing the donkey imperceptibly. Sanson says, well, that's all very well and good, but why are you perceived as riding it before you actually stole it back? To which Sancho replies, well, it must have been an error of the historian of the text, or possibly that of the printer. Now, most modern translations and most modern publications of the book do, in fact, have the narrative describing what happened to Sancho's donkey all in the correct order, so these mistakes were only in the first printing. Cervantes was very quick to go back and correct them in subsequent printings, but still uses the early pages of the second part of the book to address these issues that were brought up by the first part. Now, whether it was an error of the printers or whether it was an error of Cervantes and he just lost track of things, no one really knows. Now, one last topic as far as the blurring of reality goes. The second part of the Adventures of Don Quixote, the spurious second part, the false second part, published in 1614, a year prior to Cervantes' own, which was published in 1615. The false second part was supposedly written, we don't really know who wrote it. Again, it was written under a pseudonym, supposedly by a rival of Cervantes. The reason this is assumed to be is because the author openly insults Cervantes in the prologue to his false second part. He also goes on to dismantle a lot of the plot points that were established in Cervantes' first part. He says that Don Quixote is no longer in love with Dulcinea del Toboso. He gets the name of Sancho Panza's wife wrong. He describes action and stories in, as Cervantes would write, an unimaginative and uninteresting way. Ultimately, the publication of this book is what spurred Cervantes to actually finish his. Now, it's thought that the book in 1614, when it was published, the false part that is, Cervantes was working on chapter 59 of his own part, and ultimately the false publication is what spurred him to finish his true publication. Now, the reason we say chapter 59 is because that's the first part in the second part, the true second part, where the false second part, I'm trying to go slow, stop me if I'm going too fast. It's the first time in the true second part that Don Quixote mentions the false second part, or comes across the false second part. They're stopping at an inn for a night, and two strangers are heard speaking in the corner, and one of them says, "Read more from the second part of the Adventures of Don Quixote de la Mancha." To which Don Quixote replies, well, what is this second part? He's only heard of the first part. He hasn't heard of the second part, mostly because at that point he's living it. And they discuss at length the errors of the second part that had previously been published. Cervantes gets a couple of digs in at the unnamed author. Don Quixote actually goes well out of his way to distance himself from the Don Quixote described within the false second part. So Cervantes actually alters his own narrative simply to distinguish himself from the false narrative. At one point, Don Quixote is described as trying to go to the jousts in Saragossa, which he does in the false second part. In the true second part, upon learning that the fake Don Quixote goes to Saragossa, the true Don Quixote goes out of his way to go nowhere near Saragossa and find other jousts to attend, thus distancing himself from this false character and saying that his true adventures thus cannot be claimed to have been influenced by the false Don Quixote's adventures. Now, the things we've discussed today are just the tip of the iceberg as far as describing all of the cool and interesting stuff about Don Quixote. Despite being a rather large novel, it is, clocks in at over 1,000 pages. It does read fairly quickly. It's really just an entertaining book. It's funny, it's sad, it's really a wonderful masterpiece. I would highly recommend picking up a copy of it. You can find them everywhere. It's one of the most published books in history. Again, we've really only scratched the surface, so I would highly recommend going out, digging into it on your own. There is so much cool stuff to learn about this book, about this author, about how all of these different realities get blended and blurred together. It really is just a cool tale. Alright, well that's all we've got for you today. If you enjoyed the video, I hope you did. Be sure to hit that like button, give us a big thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button on your way out. Be sure to tune into our Twitter account at Bookworm History. The link will be down in the description below as well, to stay up to date on all of our latest news. Until next time, stay curious. Thanks for stopping by.